This is the Sun, Moon, and Talia after reading discussion. Sun, Moon, and Talia is a story that's part of a larger collection of stories called The Pentameron by Jean-Baptiste Basile. It was published in 1634, and it's a frame story, meaning there is one longer arc of story, and within that several other stories are told. Famous examples of a frame story would be the Arabian Nights and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Now, Pentameron means 5 days, and if Pentameron sounds familiar to you, it's probably because you've heard of the Decameron, 10 days, which was by Boccaccio and was published about 3 centuries before the Pentameron. The Decameron takes place during a plague, so if you're interested in pandemic literature right now, you should check it out. But Pentameron stories are fairy tales, and Sun, Moon, and Talia is considered the first written example of the Sleeping Beauty tale. Now, obviously, there are some issues with this story, and it's not something that you would probably read to your children. The main thing about this story that makes it really unpalatable to modern readers is the rape, because it's not punished. It's seemingly condoned. The king who comes and has sex with her while she's unconscious is like the OG frat boy, and when she wakes up and he comes back and they talk, she's okay with it and they fall in love, and it's this weird Luke and Laura kind of dynamic that doesn't sit well with modern readers. And it is something that certainly subsequent writers took out of their versions, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the rape part is so difficult, I think, to grapple with, that I want to address it as best I can in terms of why is there this rape that is seemingly okay? Like, he's not punished for it. And certainly one of the first arguments that comes to mind is the fact that this is written a long time ago. And so people had different ideas maybe about what was acceptable behavior or not. But I don't know that that argument holds a lot of water when you consider that in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is written almost 300 years before the Pentameron, you have the Wife of Bath's tale, which is about a knight who rapes a woman, but he has to go through this redemptive arc as a result. It is not deemed acceptable for him to have behaved the way that he behaved. So I don't think we can even say that it's just a matter of a time difference, although certainly there is a little bit of that to fall into place. We are living in the time of the Me Too movement, and we do recognize that women's voices certainly were not heard or valued the way that they are starting to be today. Now, the other part of what makes the rape upsetting is not just that the king gets away with it, but he gets away with it spectacularly in the sense that Talia falls in love with him and agrees to marry him and go join him in his kingdom. And so the question is, does she have Stockholm syndrome? Like, what's going on with her? Because I would think that, if I woke up and I had kids all of a sudden, and then a couple of years later, because if you'll notice in the story, when he comes back, they're toddlers. His kids are toddlers. Some guy shows up and says, oh yeah, I found you here, you were asleep and I had sex with you and these kids are mine. I don't think my reaction would be one of, okay, well, let's talk and get together. But again, it might be a little helpful to think about, what would Talia's options have been? She's alone in this castle. She doesn't know what's happened. Certainly her father and any other family, people from her kingdom that she would have known prior to falling asleep, they've all disappeared. Maybe they have died. Basile isn't super specific about how much time has elapsed, the way that subsequent writers are. So she's faced with not a lot of options. And so it might be a case of her thinking to herself, look, I mean, this guy's a king. That means that he has power, he has money, and if I go be his queen, I'll be provided for, and more importantly, my children will be provided for. As I was thinking about this story more after reading it, I was out running and thinking about it, and it occurred to me that there are shades of the David and Bathsheba story here, where when you think about it, Bathsheba doesn't really have a lot of options. There's a huge power dynamic going on when the king is the person who is desiring you and is, raping you and exerting his power. And as the woman who has no power, either, politically and by virtue of being a woman at a time during extreme patriarchy, going along with the king's wishes might be your best option for survival. So that makes it a little bit more palatable in terms of understanding characters in this. But it certainly is something that is really disturbing to readers. If I teach this to my students, they're not sure what to do with this. And it's why the subsequent versions by Perrault and the Grimm brothers, which I'll talk about in a second, are much more well read. So before I get to those versions, I want to talk about the cannibalism, because just like in the juniper tree, I told you cannibalism shows up more than you would think in fairy tales, and we have it here in Sun, Moon, and Talia in the second act, when Talia comes to the kingdom with the king's current wife, who wants to eat her children. Now, here we don't have the actual act of cannibalism because the children are saved. And that happens much more frequently in fairy tales, is that you only have the threat of cannibalism. And you have the savior. The cook decides, no, I can't actually kill these kids and cook them. So he hides them with his wife, and instead he cooks a lamb and, passes that off as the kids. This is something that shows up a lot, not just in fairy tales, but in other myths and literature. Other famous examples of saving kids from the fate that a powerful person wants to enact on them shows up in Snow White, right? Where the queen wants to kill Snow White and sends the huntsman to do her dirty work, and the huntsman can't do it, so he lets Snow White go, and then he kills a boar or something and presents the heart as though it's Snow White's. But also in Greek mythology with the Oedipus story, right? Oedipus is supposed to be left on a hillside to die, but the shepherd who is tasked with doing that passes him off to someone else to save him. So that's a pretty recurring theme in a lot of literature. So let's talk about subsequent versions of Sleeping Beauty and how, they got to be what we know today as opposed to Sun, Moon, and Talia. Now, when we're talking about fairy tales that are well known among Western civilization, there are two names that come up the most. One of them is Charles Perrault, who was a Frenchman writing in the late 1600s. And the other is, of course, the Grimm brothers, who are in Germany in the early 1800s. And both of these, like I said, are not writing full-on fairy tales that they've invented themselves. They're taking existing works and they are recording them in written form, and they are changing them sometimes. So Charles Perrault's version, which comes out, again, late 1600s, 1697, I think, that's only a few decades after the Pentamerone is published, and he borrows heavily from Basile's Pentamerone. In fact, it's pretty much the same story with some changes to make it more palatable. One is he gets rid of the rape. Instead, Sleeping Beauty wakes up and talks with the prince, and they fall in love and they get married, but they're secretly married for about 2 years. They have the kids, but the prince is going back and forth between his kingdom and the castle where Sleeping Beauty is, and having this kind of affair with her, even though they're married, this secret relationship with her. And the other difference is, instead of him obviously being married to someone, The villain, who later is the antagonist for Sleeping Beauty, is his mother. And Perrault makes the prince's mother be descended from ogres as a way of kind of explaining the fact that she wants to eat the kids. He doesn't seem to address what this might suggest for the prince, that he would then be half ogre. I guess he only just got human genes from his dad. I don't know. But that makes it a lot easier for modern audiences that the prince wasn't already married before, he didn't rape her, and you then move into this classic, like, oh, the mother-in-law is terrible, right? You think your mother-in-law is bad, check out, this lady who's trying to eat your kids. So that makes it a lot more palatable. But for a lot of people, they're still not really familiar with that second part of the story, right? After Sleeping Beauty wakes up, most people are more familiar with, right, the Disney version, where that's kind of the end. They get married and live happily ever after. That second part, a lot of scholars agree, is actually a second story. And what Basile did is he smushed two stories together to create this one story, and then Perrault, because he borrowed so heavily from Basile, did the same thing. The Grimms, however, don't do that. They end at Sleeping Beauty's waking up, or their story is Briar Rose, is what it's called. They end with her waking up and she and the prince get together, and that's the end. And then there's a totally different story that involves, the ogress trying to eat somebody's kids. So the way that Sleeping Beauty is awoken changes based on which version you're familiar with or you're reading. Obviously, in Sun, Moon, and Talia, her infant sucks the splinter out of her finger and then she awakes again. This is really similar to the way that Snow White is awoken in the original Grimm version, which is whatever implement it is that is in the person's body that creates that death for them. Once it is extracted, then they awaken again. Actually, I think it's both the Perrault and the Grimm version. It's that a certain amount of time has elapsed, and it's time for the person to awake. In the Grimm version especially, it's 100 years specifically. You have the introduction of the fairies who are bestowing the Aurora or Briar Rose or Sleeping Beauty. She's not actually named until you get to the Grimm version with Briar Rose. Aurora, the name Aurora, actually comes from one of the names given to her children. So in Sun, Moon, and Talia, her children are Sun and Moon. In Perrault's version, the children's names are Day and Dawn or something like that, right? And one of them at some point is Dawn, or Aurora is one of the children's names, and then I think it's Disney who actually adopted Aurora as the name for Sleeping Beauty. But anyway, she's put into this sleep, and you have the idea of the curse with the Grimm version, and that's what Disney uses when they bring in Maleficent and all of that. And the curse is that she'll die, and then one of the fairies who is still able to give one last gift, she's not strong enough to break the curse, but she can alter it so that she's sleeping for 100 years. And that's what happens. She sleeps for 100 years. That's enough time for anybody who is outside the kingdom to have aged and died. And so it becomes more of a legend and less of a fact, right? That there is this castle with this Sleeping Beauty in it. It becomes sort of almost like this legend that circles around, and there are different princes in the Grimm version who try to get to the castle, and they can't because of all the briars. And it's not until the 100 years have passed, there's this prince who's on his way, and the briars part for him because the 100 years are over, and he gets into the castle, and people start waking up because it's been 100 years. It's not very satisfying because the prince doesn't have to do anything. He just is in the right place at the right time. Oh, 100 years is over. I guess everybody's waking up. Here I am. I'm a prince. Here's this beautiful girl who's been asleep for a century. Let's get married. There's no kiss. That's something that is invented later on as what wakes her up. So I think many of the Sleeping Beauty stories are not incredibly satisfying to read, because that dynamic of a prince who's doing something heroic or a princess who's doing something sort of heroic, they're all gone. I mean, the princess, this is the ultimate example of the passive princess. I mean, she's asleep the whole story. So it's hard to cheer for her. I mean, you don't wish her ill, but there's no personality there to look at. And it's the same thing with the prince. In the later versions, obviously in Sun, Moon, and Talia especially, you can't cheer for the king in that one because he's a terrible person who rapes her and cheats on his wife. Like, he's already married and cheats on his wife by raping this girl, and it's a whole mess and for a modern audience in terms of morality and who you're going to cheer for. So that's why Sun, Moon, and Talia, very interesting to read, a lot to process, really interesting to trace how it evolved and kind of obviously why it evolved over time, but definitely not a story to tell the kids at night. Stick with maybe the Grimm version of Briar Rose. Until next time, I wish you a happily ever after.